Welcome, welcome. All right. So hello again. My name is Mackenzie Mansell, and I will be your host for How to Measure Welcoming Communities. This workshop will be delivered in English. There is a live French translation available by simply clicking on the globe icon with interpretation written below it. We have time to answer your questions towards the end of the workshop. Creating an environment that genuinely welcomes newcomers is not just about the first step, but the journey they take as they settle, integrate, and become valued community members. Our workshop will be co-facilitated by 3 dynamic subject matter experts who will delve into the critical aspects of measuring the welcoming experience and its impact on the long-term retention and integration of newcomers. Our first presenter is Victoria Esses, the Principal Investigator of the Pathways to Prosperity Partnership. She is also Professor of Psychology and Director of the Network for Economic and Social Trends at Western University. Her research focuses on immigration policy and practice, including public attitudes towards immigration and cultural diversity, promising practices in settlement and integration, factors promoting the settlement and integration of immigrants, and the measurement of community welcomeability, immigrant needs, and immigrant outcomes. As a volunteer, Victoria is the Research Liaison for the London and Middlesex Local Immigration Partnership and serves as chair of its Welcoming Communities Work Group and its Measuring Outcomes Work Group. She is a fellow of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. Our second presenter is Dr. Leah Hamilton, the Vice Dean, Research and Community Relations and Professor of Organizational Behavior in the Faculty of Business and Communication Studies at Mount Royal University. She is a community-engaged scholar who works with newcomer communities and the settlement sector to better understand newcomers' resettlement needs and outcomes. Her research is funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. Our third presenter is Dan Van de Belt, the Research and Data Lead with the Immigration Partnership in Waterloo Region. He works with diverse partners from the local community and many of the 80 other immigration partnerships across Canada, analyzing and increasing the accessibility of data from Statistics Canada, IRCC, or local sources. The Waterloo Region Immigration Partnership is also engaged in primary data collection, like regular surveys of partners or the public, and biannual surveys of immigrants. So please join me in welcoming all of our speakers today. I'm going to throw it over to Victoria and Leah to kick us off with their presentation. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Mackenzie. So, Leah Hamilton and I are very pleased today to be talking about the work we've been doing with Awish Aslam and Priscilla Byras to develop welcoming communities toolkits. Next slide, please. So to begin, we have to talk about what we mean when we're using the term welcoming communities. And we define a welcoming community as a collective effort to design and sustain a place where immigrants feel that they belong and that supports their social, economic, cultural, and civic political integration. And a welcoming community has structures, it has processes, and it has practices in place to meet the needs and promote the inclusion of immigrants in all aspects of life. And importantly, a welcoming community actively works to ensure that these are effective. So not only does it have these in place, but it actually measures and makes sure that these are effective. Next slide, please. So why is work on welcoming communities particularly important? Well, work on welcoming communities is particularly important at this time for a number of reasons. First, welcoming communities are needed to support the successful integration of immigrants, which is essential because, as we know, the 2023 to 2025 immigration levels plan means that a large number of immigrants are coming in each year. And we know that by 2025, the goal is 500,000 new immigrants expected to arrive in Canada each year. Now, Canada is also depending on immigration to facilitate post-COVID recovery. And finally, maintaining the vitality of smaller Canadian communities and of Francophone minority communities often depends on the attraction and retention of immigrants, including Francophone immigrants. In addition, we know that there's continuing emphasis on outcome measurement, including at the community level. And this is to ensure that the work we're doing to promote welcoming communities and to support the settlement and integration of newcomers is having an impact. So we're not only doing this work, but we're measuring to make sure that it's effective. And perhaps most importantly, creating welcoming communities is a social justice issue. We attract, as we've said, many immigrants to Canada each year, and this really needs to be paired with providing them the welcome they require to thrive. So it's not enough to bring in people. We have to really provide them with the supports they need so that they thrive. So to support communities becoming more welcoming, we've been working on two toolkits. One is on measuring welcoming communities, and the other is on promoting welcoming communities. And the first toolkit on measuring welcoming communities is complete. It's available on our website, which we'll show the URL later on. And the second one on promoting welcoming communities will be released later this year or early next year. We see the two toolkits as being used together in what we consider to be a 5-step approach for working towards welcoming communities. So before you get started, you really have to know the state of your community. And so step 1 is assessment of the current state of the community, and that's what Toolkit 1 will help with. And based on that information, it's possible to develop short-term and long-term goals based on knowledge, for example, of a community's strengths and gaps or weaknesses. Again, Toolkit 1 can help with that. Then it's important to implement or adjust policies and programs that are designed to target those gaps and weaknesses and work towards the goals. And this is where the second toolkit will come into play. Now, once you've been doing this work and you've implemented new or adjusted your policies and programs, it's really important to do systematic research to evaluate whether what you're doing is effective. So to evaluate the effectiveness of the policies and programs. So Toolkit 1, you can go back to Toolkit 1 to do that. And the goal is to find out whether the changes that you're making to improve the state of the community on specific targeted characteristics are having an effect and the effect that you desire. And of course, this is an iterative process. Communities are not stagnant, so it's important to continually do ongoing assessment of the community outcomes, going back to Toolkit 1 and feedback to step 2. So as I mentioned, Toolkit 1 is now complete, and this is what we'll be focusing on today. And Toolkit 1 includes the key characteristics of a welcoming community and indicators that can be used to measure each characteristic. And so more specifically, in addition to a report on the characteristics of a welcoming community and their indicators, Toolkit 1 includes a number of things. First of all, it includes a presentation deck that community leaders can use to facilitate conversations within their community. It includes questions that can be used for an environmental scan. These questions address crucial features of a community that may influence its approaches to assessing and working towards a welcoming community. It includes a checklist that communities can use to rank order the importance of the 19 characteristics that we've identified as important for communities and decide among those 19 which are most important to measure at a specific time. And then it includes a checklist of indicators to be used to assess the selected characteristics and also to decide what comparisons will be made using these indicators. So that's a lot of information. Let's go through these tools in a bit more detail. So the first tool is designed to help with conducting an environmental scan. And this is needed so that interested parties can identify features of their community that may impact how they're going to approach creating and promoting a welcoming community. So here are some examples of features that can help set the stage. It's really important to kind of know what's going on in your community, what are some of the strengths, and what are some of the gaps perhaps, and what is the focus of the community, what's the demographic background of the community, in order to set the stage for work that's going to come. Next, we move on to the specific characteristics that make a community welcoming. Now, to determine these characteristics, we did a number of things. First of all, we reviewed recent literature in this area. This included not only gray literature and academic literature, websites, it included all literature available to us. In addition to this, we pulled 259 key informants from all levels of government and others working in the area of immigrant settlement and integration, asking what they consider to be characteristics. Once we had some characteristics, presenting these to various informants and asking them about them. And in the end, we identified 19 characteristics of welcoming communities, and we put them into clusters in order of relative importance based on some consensus among respondents. But of course, we know that the importance of each characteristic to a given community will vary somewhat. And we also know that these characteristics don't exist in isolation. They influence each other, and they may increase or decrease the impact of one another. So for example, we know that discrimination in a community or negative attitudes about immigration or racial diversity can influence all sorts of other characteristics. How people do obtaining housing, employment, when they're using public areas, etc. And of importance, we want to stress that when considering the characteristics, we have to take into account the needs of multi-barriered immigrants. And this includes racialized women, youth, seniors, 2S, LGBTQI+ individuals, refugees, immigrants with disabilities, for example. So tool 2 is designed to help communities decide on priority characteristics for their community. And the tool includes the list of the 19 characteristics we've identified, and it asks individuals to rank these characteristics either alone or in a group in terms of their importance for that specific community. And then you can look at community consensus. So over to you now, Leah.
Thanks, Vicki. Okay, so let's talk for a minute about these 19 characteristics. So when we did our literature review and polled the key informants, there was a lot of consensus that the characteristics listed on these slide were the top 5. The order within this cluster is more tenuous or uncertain, but we have access to affordable, adequate, and suitable housing, employment and entrepreneurship opportunities, access to suitable healthcare, including mental health care. There's a big focus on mental health care in this new toolkit, positive attitudes toward immigrants of all racial, cultural, and religious backgrounds, and access to immigrant serving agencies that meet immigrants' needs. Moving now to cluster B, these are also very important, but there's a bit less consensus on the order. So access to transportation, educational opportunities, ongoing commitment to anti-racism and anti-oppression, which is also a new characteristic in the revised toolkit, access to services and supports for French-speaking immigrants by French speakers, and immigrant responsive municipal features and services. So moving now to cluster C, again, a bit less consensus. There's 2 slides. There's quite a few in this cluster. And these are also considered among the top 19 characteristics of a welcoming community, but a bit less important than the ones you've seen before, generally speaking. Coordination and collaboration among community organizations and different levels of government working toward welcoming communities, equitable neighborhoods, opportunities to form and join social and community networks, immigrant responsive police services and justice system, access to inclusive public spaces, facilities, and programs, positive Indigenous immigrant relations and understanding, access to diverse religious and ethnocultural organizations, civic and political participation opportunities, and equitable media coverage, representation, and content. So I want to move now to tool 3, which is another tool in this Measuring Welcoming Communities toolkit. And this tool is designed to help communities select comparisons to be made and indicators they can use to actually assess or sort of measure the welcome of their community. So based on the purpose of this assessment and needs of the community, individuals are asked to check off the comparisons to current immigrants in the community that should be made at this time. So essentially, for each of the priority characteristics that a community identifies in tool 2, so that would mean when they look at the 19 characteristics that I just talked about, if they would say prioritize 3 of them, for example, then individuals or in groups of individuals are asked to check off which indicators are most relevant and most feasible at a given time for a current assessment. And we recommend that communities choose multiple indicators for each characteristics, kind of choosing a mix of objective and subjective indicators. And I'll show you an example in a second, but essentially what these indicators are quantitative and qualitative measures that can be used to assess the level of a given characteristic in a community at a given time. So as we suggested, we do encourage communities to look at multiple indicators. And to give you an example, here are some, not all, of our indicators for the characteristic on access to affordable, adequate, and suitable housing. So we have housing affordability, available housing is of adequate quality, evidence of overcrowded housing, rate of supply and vacancy of suitable housing, rate of home ownership, evidence of discrimination in acquiring and living in housing, availability of reliable information in both official languages and other top languages of new arrivals about housing markets and tenants' rights and responsibilities. And then we also have some more subjective or perception indicators, including level of satisfaction with information for immigrants about housing in Canada and tenants' rights and responsibilities, and level of satisfaction with current housing situation. So this is only about half of the indicators that we have. I just wanted to give you an example of what we're talking about when we use the term indicators. So essentially, communities would pick the top characteristics, choose some indicators, hopefully objective and subjective or perceptual indicators, and then also think about meaningful characteristics that they want to use when measuring these characteristics. So maybe they want to look at comparisons to non-immigrants in the community, comparisons to previous cohorts of immigrants that arrived at a different time, comparison to other communities or to provincial territorial averages, comparisons before and after new initiatives are implemented to sort of look at whether theories of change are actually working, and then comparisons among different groups of immigrants, including multi-barriered groups, which, as Victoria said earlier, is really important. So as we mentioned earlier, Toolkit 2 is in progress. We plan to have it released probably early in 2024. It will focus on promoting welcoming communities and include descriptions of promising practices for each of those 19 characteristics, including a description of the key processes and structures that make these promising practices effective. So we hope that that gave you a bit of an idea about the toolkits. We do welcome your questions and comments. And of course, you can always email us if you'd like to follow up. Here I've put a QR code that links directly to the toolkit. If that's not working for you, you can also Google P2P, which stands for Pathways to Prosperity, Welcoming Communities. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Victoria and Leah, for sharing the Measuring Welcoming Communities toolkit. I did make sure to pop that link into our chat today. And I know toolkit number 2 is highly anticipated, so can't wait to see that. With that being said, I'm going to throw it over to Dan. Dan, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Mackenzie and Vicki and Leah. I'm struck by how much overlap there is with what we have found in Waterloo Region, you know, as affirmation of that a lot of those factors are things that have come up in our conversations, and what we found works on a specific community basis. And so it's really great to see that. Our approach with listening to immigrants is a little bit heavier on the subjective perception, asking immigrants, how welcoming do you feel this is, by different measures, but also collecting some of those pieces around what does a welcoming community look like. So yeah, as Mackenzie noted, I'm the data research and evaluation lead with the Immigration Partnership in Waterloo Region, Ontario. And so I've been involved for many years, but I'm not a research expert. What I've learned is, on the ground doing this for the last 25 years or so. I want to, if we go to the next slide, I want to start with the talking about the survey itself, and then share some initial findings, and then a few thoughts about measuring welcoming that came out of this. So the history of it, why a survey? It's not the only way, but it's really good at breadth. It's not particularly good for depth or nuance. You need more focus groups, interviews, participatory processes, everyday listening for that type of thing. But it is good for breadth. What is the situation across the entire community? What are the general feelings of immigrants? And then, being able to drill down by different groups. But again, that breadth piece. We had an evaluation advisory committee, or have, and a data and evaluation framework to guide our overall work, with a theory of change and key indicators that direct us to what we need to measure and track in order to see what we need to focus on and if we're making an impact. A key reason our community did a survey is that we looked at what we needed to measure and what was available, and realized that a bunch of it wasn't available at our local geography or with the timing or nuance that we needed. So we came to the conclusion that we needed to gather it ourselves. We did a general community survey in 2017 that included immigrants, partners, employers, general public, etc. Got some good information, but found it general. We heard from 200 newcomers, but we're also hearing from all these other groups. And so we split that up in subsequent years, and a survey just of immigrants in 2019, reaching about 1,100 immigrants, and define that broadly: anyone born outside of Canada and now living, working, or studying in our community. So it includes temporary residents, longtime residents, that sort of thing. We repeated that and refined the tool and the questions, added a few more things in 2021, and we reached 1,500 immigrants. Then this year in 2023, we opened up the survey to other local immigration partnerships across Canada to join us in this survey. And we would each do our own local surveys, but we would work together on it using a similar tool and processes that we developed collectively, but really working from what we had developed over the years in Waterloo Region as a starting point. So we have 7 other LIPs, local immigration partnerships, for those who aren't familiar. So I call it LIPs, doing the survey right now, plus another 13 as part of our group by email or being part of meetings to learn for possible future surveys in their own communities. And in the future, I'd like to have conversations with IRCC about what we've learned and how some of this could be integrated at a broader national level or available to all LIPs. So this, there's a QR code there, and then our survey website if you want to follow that and get more information. In terms of our processes, I'll just go through a couple of those key pieces. In terms of planning, we work together with all the other LIPs and developing the tool, trying to maintain as much continuity with the past and StatsCan survey wording and the CCHS survey, the discrimination survey that a number of immigration partnerships, as well as Vicki and Leah, had been involved in. And so continuity being key, but also, being adaptable to, new things that were coming up. And so that mix of both those is important. Collaboration was key in that, because we each brought what was critical for our communities, and then we pulled that together. Translation is really key. If you're not translating a survey, there's a chunk of your population that probably won't be able to participate. 10 to, probably at least 10% who will find it difficult or impossible to participate, if not quite a bit more. And I didn't find it that hard with the online survey software that we used. Actually, it was fairly seamless, but there are challenges in moving between English and a language you don't know, double checking and that it's complex. And so it's important, but there are some challenges. And so learning from what others have done and some of the processes that others might have put in place is really valuable. And there's no magic number. It could be translating into just French as an official language, just 1 or 2 or 3 of the significant languages in your community. In our community, we translated into 11 because we had the budget to be able to do that, and saw that it was important to reach particular groups, but there is no magic number for that. Ethics is another piece. In the past, we hadn't gone through a formal ethics review, but we always made sure that we were abiding by all those principles that an ethics review would bring up. And we had a number of academic researchers and people who are well versed in that in their other lives to bring that perspective. This year, we did go through that. We went through it with the Community Research Ethics Office, CREO, and that was a really good process. CREO is probably more oriented to a community-based setting than an academic setting. And so, what does that look like in terms of wording, in terms of consent, and a number of, promotion and that sort of thing. Partnerships and outreach or promotion, that was really key. We couldn't reach the number of immigrants we did without partnerships. It was through those partnerships. And where our partners see this is our survey. Like, it's not something that the Immigration Partnership as a staff team does, it's our community survey, and we see this as valuable. In terms of outreach, we did this, we set up targets to see, according to the census or other means, what if we reached our target, this year is 1,500, how many of this group should we be hearing from? What percentage of this group and of this group and this group? And so we set up, I think it was 25 different targets for subgroups. And then during the promotion or the data collection period, we check to see, are we reaching those targets for each of those groups? And then we would adjust outreach and promotion accordingly. And so in no way is our survey a representative survey, but we did a number of things to make it as representative as possible. And I think that's an important distinction. Data cleaning, it was challenging this year, especially because we had a number of bot responses. So, and I've been hearing that more and more public surveys are struggling with this. And so it's important to be aware of that when you're making your survey tool, so that you can have a number of things that might give you an indicator of what is a bot response and what is not a bot response, because they're getting really good with AI responses to open-ended questions, and they are challenging to figure out, oh, that's a human, that's a bot. But there are a number of tests and stuff that you can say, oh, a bot tends to respond this way, therefore I'm going to structure it in this way so that it'll trip up a bot, but not a human. And then I can kind of say, oh, based on this and this, that's probably a bot, and you can strip those out so that you don't have this noise of junk responses in your eventual data. So that data cleaning and getting rid of that was really important. Analysis and disaggregation is where we're at right now. Disaggregation is so important because the general numbers often hide what's really happening underneath. It might look decent with the overall numbers. This many people think Waterloo Region is quite welcoming. But who are the groups who don't feel that, who have a significant proportion who say, I did not find Waterloo Region welcoming? Why? And who are those groups and why? What are those other factors that are coming into play there? And so that disaggregation doesn't have to be really challenging if you set things up well. And yet it's so important. Now it is limited by your sample size. And so if you have 1,500 responses, you can do a lot more than if you have 100, 200, 300. So there is a big factor around number of responses. And then we're planning to share it, doing a number of topic-based reports, working with individuals to say, what data do you need for your purposes in your organization, whether it's learning, whether it's education for your board, whether it's a funding application, whether it's a new program, what do you need from this data? How can we use this in concrete ways? And then bring it to various community tables and planning groups and councils and groups that can say, okay, this is what we're hearing. These are the trends. This is what immigrants themselves are saying. Now what can we do? That it needs to lead to action. And that's the power of data. And if we don't spend a significant chunk of time doing that, then our data is slightly better than useless. And so it's really about that action. What do we do with the data? Let's go to the next slide. So I'll just go through a little bit of the findings that we had this year in Waterloo Region. We had almost 1,700 valid responses once we took out the bot responses and people who were born in Canada and that sort of thing. 2/3 filled out the survey in English online, and about 1/3 filled it out in other translated languages. Some of those were, some of them were online, both the English and the translated, and some were in paper format. 2/3 were newcomers to Canada. Last time we did the survey, it was a little bit less, and so we got more brand new newcomers this time. There's many people who didn't have English as a first language. 14% had English as a first language, but 77% spoke English well or very well. And so that kind of speaks to, hey, English works. But then on the other hand, 1% spoke it not at all, and 8% spoke English poorly. And so those are the people that we need to say, so how do we do other mechanisms to hear from them, whether it's translated surveys or engaging with them through their community in their language, that sort of thing. Next slide. So what did we find? We found affordability is the top concern. This was a new kind of specific focus this year that we didn't have previously, and it jumped right to the top. How do I afford the increased cost of living? And tied to that is housing. It was an increasing struggle for many. It's been increasing over the last couple cycles that we've done the survey every other year. And then employment is always a top concern. In 2021, it was a top concern. This year, it was number 3, more or less tied with housing. Community belonging and integration improved somewhat after the pandemic. We did see a drop in, or an increase in isolation during the pandemic, as was probably expected. And that has drifted back up to what it was before. I don't know if it's exactly the same as it was before. I'll have to double check. And then overall well-being, kind of how satisfied do you feel with your life right now? That slipped a little bit in the past over the past 2 years, but I'd like to see a longer trend before I say this is where it's going. And satisfaction with services shifted. We asked, what did you access different services? Housing, employment, health, mental health, police, etc. And did you access them? And what was your experience with them? How would you rate that? And so some that were at the top might have slipped, and some that at the bottom, went up somewhat, but more or less, housing was down near the bottom, and healthcare wasn't too high. It was somewhere down there, I believe. But there's, in general, greater dissatisfaction. And so that's something we need to pull apart. Next slide. So these are some of the questions that we asked specifically about welcoming, belonging, and integration, asking newcomers. So some of the things in the rest of the survey and in the welcoming toolkit are about, how do we measure objectively how welcoming this community is? These are a lot about asking, what was your experience? Those perception or subjective measures. So how welcoming is Waterloo Region towards immigrants? And 55% felt that Waterloo Region was quite welcoming. It's roughly similar to 2021, increasing slightly. And so where this becomes really interesting is when we, as I mentioned before, who didn't find it as welcoming? What are those groups? And then we can have more in-depth conversations with them about why. How can we change that? How can we shift that? How would you describe your sense of belonging? This one has stayed surprisingly similar over the last 3 cycles. 71, 72, I think one year, the year before is 72, somewhere between 70 and 73. So all pretty similar, had a strong sense of belonging in Waterloo Region. And the wording of the question does differ. Sometimes people ask your sense of belonging to Waterloo Region, in this community, in your community. And so that wording probably makes a significant difference in terms of comparability. How much have you felt isolated or alone? And that's a key one that did improve slightly since the pandemic. In the last 12 months, have you experienced discrimination or been treated unfairly? This one also showing a lot of similarity between 22 to 24% over the last 6 years, 2019, 21, and 23 now. And then next slide then. Then 5 other questions. How do you describe your experience of settling? Were you happy with that? Did you have a positive experience? About 3/4 had a positive settlement experience. And again, fairly consistent. This was a new question. How long did it take you to feel at home in this community? And we've had lots of conversations about how many people, how long does it take them to feel settled here? And that was, sometimes for some people it's, quickly, some people it's a long time. And so quantifying that sum, I think was really valuable. I didn't know what the median time would be. It turned out that it was about a year. Half said that they felt at home when they first arrived or within the first year, and half said it took more than a year. And so and for some groups, I'm eager to dig into the disaggregating that to see what groups took longer. Is it based on language ability? Is it based on where they come from, racialized status, immigration category, that sort of thing? But how long did it take to feel at home in this community was, I think, an interesting one that we'll have a lot of stuff to pull apart from that. And then the retention. How likely are you to stay permanently in Waterloo Region? So 62% felt that they might stay permanently, either for sure or possibly, and 6% don't plan on staying. We didn't ask why that was, but we might find some hints to that from other questions. And then this qualitative that I haven't analyzed yet, what is the most important thing that community leaders should do to improve the welcoming, integration, and well-being of immigrants in Waterloo Region? A host of comments from housing, employment, community services, immigration barriers and issues, all sorts of, welcoming, kind of a feeling of welcoming by the public, that sort of thing. So next slide, just a few thoughts before about measuring welcoming. And just very quickly, connecting it to a framework and being intentional. What do we want to collect and why? What are we going to use it for? How is it going to tell us what we need to know in order to take action? Surveys are just one way to listen. There are other ways, and we need to have that multiplicity of approaches. A survey may look different depending on your capacity of resources. Some of the LIPs in other communities, it was quite small, volunteer-driven, not a lot of dollars for translation or promotion or that sort of thing. And that is okay. And, things can change over time, or it can look different in different communities. Asking immigrants about their experiences complements measuring broader community factors. And measuring welcoming is probably a whole bunch of things. As Vicky and Leah said, it's multifaceted, and there's lots of different things that we want to measure to say, is our community welcoming? And if there are enough responses, disaggregation is critical. Also, disaggregating other survey data can be a great source of information. We did that with a couple other surveys, and got some really good data that we're going to integrate in so we could see, both for immigrants and non-immigrants, how do they compare? And we didn't have to run the survey. We were just able to access the raw data and disaggregate it for 10-year recent immigrants in that case. And we also did a survey of public perceptions of immigration. That was a useful piece to pull in as well. And then using existing surveys, processes, and examples is ideal. And we're more than happy to share anything that we've got. We are planning to pull together, all these different LIPs are planning to pull together a toolkit of doing a survey of immigrants in your community, of things that we had learned, and pulling that together with our tool and consent letters and all that sort of stuff. And we're always willing to share. And so last slide, get in touch if you ever have any questions or want to, pull some of the stuff that we did.
Thank you so much, Dan. The survey is such a great example of a tool that helps regions listen, amplify the voices of immigrants, and start to build those policies around that. So thanks very much for sharing that. So as we transition into the Q&A portion of our time together, just a couple of housekeeping items. To the right of your screen on the FeedLoop platform, you'll see a chat window. So please feel free to use this feature if you have some comments or questions for our presenters today. You can type them there, and we'll try and get to as many as we can. I know some have already come through, so I'm just going to read the first one, which is for Victoria and Leah. The welcoming toolkit that you developed has 3 focuses: environmental scan, characteristics ranking exercise, and choosing comparators and indicators. Since the toolkits have released in March 2023, have any community success stories of engaging with the toolkit surfaced that you can share?
That's a great question. We have heard that communities are starting to use the toolkit. I don't think that there's like a complete process that's gone on yet. Because as we described, there are many steps to the cycle, the 5-step cycle that we talked about. But we do know that communities are, for example, using the characteristic checklist and starting to think about the indicators.
Do you have anything to add to that, Leah?
No, just that it's a great question. And one of the things Vicki and I have been talking about is having a bit of an evaluation plan on the toolkit. So there's a lot of community engagement. We've been giving lots of talks across the country. Lots of LIPs and communities are very interested in our getting started. And we are going to sit down and develop a plan so that we have a sense of the impact and things that are working well, because we do see this toolkit and the development of the different tools as iterative, and we want to make sure communities are engaged the whole time.
That's wonderful. Definitely can't wait to see how the engagement grows over the coming months and years. All right, so the second question is for Dan. Dan, what has been your biggest lesson learned through the collaborative development of surveys to assess newcomer experience?
One of the things that I think was so many things that we've learned, but one thing was how to keep a local focus and yet work with others. And the way we did that was by, so Waterloo Region was going through the process, for their third time. And so we had a bit of experience. We went through the process just a bit before the others. And so we prepared our ethics application and then shared it with the others right after we submitted it. And then we created promotional materials and then shared it. I created a analysis kind of template and then shared it. And our target so that they could easily create response targets for different subgroups. That sort of thing worked really well, where we keep our local focus and yet we can learn from others. It takes a little bit more time to kind of share it, but the benefits is, far outweighs that. So that, I think, is an important thing for a community. How do we link into stuff that others are doing and yet keep that local focus where, where mandate is? So that's not so much, that's kind of how we did it. And then so many other pieces along the way around, translation and disaggregation and bots and using AI in qualitative data analysis, all sorts of stuff. But that's one of them.
That's great, Dan. Thanks so much for that insight. So we have another question coming in from Feedloop for Vicki and Leah. For communities who are positioned to start to measure how welcoming they are, but are nervous to take the first step and are engaging with your toolkit, what small, medium, initial steps would you recommend to help them gain confidence with committing to this journey? Big question.
I think a really important point is that you don't have to do everything at once. So think about the characteristics you think are most important and look at the indicators and think about which ones you may already have data for, or that where to get those data. And as Leah said, we really see this as an iterative process. So we will actually at some point be doing workshops on where data are available. But you don't have to do everything. I guess that's our message. Just start with a few characteristics you think are key. And, this toolkit is based on a report we released back in 2010, I think it was. And, people took the pieces that they thought they could use right away from that report. I think the toolkit's a lot more practical, and I guess the message is think about what you can do now and what you think is most important.
Can I jump in too? I agree with everything Vicky said. And I also think that those of you that are in the room can really learn a lot from listening to Dan's journey. I mean, if I heard you correctly, Dan, you said in 2017, you had 200 newcomers fill out your survey. And now in 2023, you're up to over 1,600. And so, you know, that's in 6 years, you've completely transformed what you're doing. And every year it sounds like you learned from it and tweaked things and did it a little bit differently. And I think there's a lot of key learnings there that really speak to this question of confidence and how do you get started. It won't be perfect, but getting started is really important. The other thing I would suggest to build on what Vicky said is Vicky and I are always happy to chat. If that can help around, oh, I feel overwhelmed. There's so many possibilities of what we can do. That's true. There are, but we're happy to chat with you and maybe even run a little workshop with the key people in your community to talk about, okay, what makes sense for you. We're really happy to do that work. And even starting with that environmental scan, I think will help you really set the stage for what you want to do.
Can I jump in on that as well?
Go ahead, Dan.
What I've found is that when we look back, like that iterative building on what you've learned from the previous one, I think is so important, because when we look back from our third iteration, we'll see that our first iteration was almost just a practice run, because we've learned so much more in our second and third. And by the time we get to our fifth iteration, we'll probably look back at our third iteration and say, that was just a practice run, because we're so much stronger, you know, we've learned so much more now. And so it's that idea of you just start somewhere, start small, probably smaller than you would prefer, because you can't boil the ocean. And then you learn from that, and that building over time. We're working on, someone challenged me, you know, what would a 20-year horizon look like for a data plan? You know, let's look a lot longer than just what do I need in the next year or the next 2 years, but how can I build this over time to something that's really strong and really gets me what I need to really make the change that will make a difference.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that. So before I close out our session today, I just want to thank our presenters again so much for being here, sharing your insights, your strategies, your expertise. It's really invaluable to all our attendees today. So thank you so much. So this actually closes our Eastern Ontario Immigrant Attraction and Retention Strategy Virtual Summit. We hope you enjoyed all of our sessions and our workshops over the past 2 days. Resources and hopefully some recordings of the sessions will be available afterwards. And yeah, so thank you so much for attending. Merci, miigwech. Have a great rest of your day and Thanksgiving weekend. Take care.